Welcome back to the Command Your Brand Show. This is the latest in our series of icons. Icons are some of the individuals that we have worked with that they just create incredible effects with what they do in the podcasting world. And then the feedback we get about them is incredible. So I want to unpack who they are, what they think, what they're doing, so that you guys can apply some of these things and really create those impacts for yourself and your business, because we're all about helping you do that. Reminder, if you guys are brand new to this channel, to like this video, comment, and subscribe if you want to be out there and command your brand as well. So I want to welcome somebody who I absolutely love. He's one of my favorite people. His name is Riggs Eckelberry. He's with a company called OriginClear that is doing some incredible things in the world of water. So Riggs, thank you for hanging out with me today, sir.
Well, it's an honor and a pleasure, and I'm glad to know that I'm an icon. That's kind of cool.
Well, to me, I was looking, I'm like, what is different about these people? And I was like, they're icons, right? They're people that they're almost like a shining light to help others, right? Like it's the way I was trying to describe it. And I was trying to think of how to describe this to others is like, you see certain CEOs and founders and they build a good business and they've helped some people, but you see in these other people, this shift to like, do something really big for mankind and build a business. And you're one of those people.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the honor.
So for people that may not know who you are and what you do, tell us a little about who you are and what you do, Riggs.
Sure. Well, I'm my name is Riggs, and I came up through a very, very eclectic pathway. I started, I was brought up internationally. I got into the nonprofit space. I even became a ship captain in the South Pacific, carrying all kinds of exotic things, and then learned marketing. And in the 80s, I started a business in New York City, computerizing companies for the first time. That was a big learning experience because carrying a payroll of 12 people in Manhattan without any capital was really, really interesting. And it was also my first big learning experience, which I'll talk about later if it matters. But fast forward, I did more things to gain more experience after I gave away that business to my best salesman. He made a big success of it, and I got my learning experience. Did a lot of other things like direct marketing and so forth, and eventually landed in the .com, which was my space. The .com was just amazing. It was fast. It was crazy. Lots of transformation. Computers were no longer for computing. They were also for communication, right? Mm-hmm. Whole new world. And that really appealed to me. So I did well in that. I did even better after the year 2000 because that shook out all the dross, right? All the crappy companies got shaken out by year 2000. And after that, we did some really good work. Fast forward to about 2006, and I was taking a company public to the NASDAQ in the software space as the president and COO. And I'd kind of in 10 years, I'd gone from a product manager position, rolling out a Windows 95 product in 1995, to this number 2 role in a company going to the NASDAQ. And yet that wasn't good enough. I wanted to be a CEO. Like all number 2s, I thought I could be a better number 1. That is the curse of the number 2, right? And watch what you wish for. So I got to be a CEO, but it was in a brand new space, not software. It was this crazy space called algae for biofuels, and very promising. It remains promising, but it requires a very high price of crude, and it just wasn't there. So after a while, we realized that with the price of crude crashing because of fracking, algae was not realistic, and we did a pivot. We adapted and moved into water with the same technology, and that's where I learned that water is very change phobic, and it just doesn't want to change. Everything's fine, but it's actually, the more I learned about it, the more of a disaster things were in water, and as a result of the disaster, a trend towards decentralization, people doing their own water treatment, not relying on the utilities, which were generally failing. And so I became a real proselytizer for this new decentralized or distributed water treatment. In 2016, everybody thought I was nuts. Now it's a thing. But so we were early in the space. We started building companies that specialized in that. So we ended up with a combination of companies that we then monetized and have now put into a merger agreement for a company to acquire them to get on the NASDAQ. And that's what's going on right now. Meanwhile, my original company, OriginClear, continues its role as a funding accelerator. But we're really, really busy right now getting this wonderful company, which has very special usefulness and a good reason. It's a real transformation, getting onto the NASDAQ. And when I say transformation, Jeremy, you were talking about people who have a higher mission. Well, Peter Thiel puts it very, very well. He says, look, you can do a 1+1 business, like yet another Amazon sales operation, and that's fine. You're not changing anything radically. You're expected to make money. It's not a big capital drain. But it's kind of like adds to the motion, right? Whereas he says there's a 0-1 business where there was nothing before and now there's something. And that requires capital, and it's, you have to sort of overcome all the inertia, and it becomes highly disruptive, but you can get into a big hockey stick and a giant win because of it and really change conditions. And that's what excited me about what we're doing.
So let me ask you this, because I think the thing I find very interesting about you, and just it's also a lot of like who you are. But I guess when you look at it, you're innately an educator, I think, is a big part of what you're doing. But you educate in the way that, like, it seems like understanding for you is a huge part of what you're doing. Because like, I think when you look at some people, they educate in a way, but a way that overwhelms. You're good at educating in a way that's set for understanding. I guess, why have you focused so much on education in what you do?
Well, the problem is really, there's a great saying. My wife and I love Ted Lasso, and he said something. He said, "Be curious, not judgmental." Right? That's a very good saying, because it puts you in the right frame of mind for me to be interested in you, right? As opposed to being like Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake. And especially these days, we have a phenomenon of a few people becoming insanely rich, and it's only going to get worse. We're getting into the space opera. I read a lot of science fiction, and you get these stories about advanced civilizations where a few people are galactically rich. Right? It just gets ridiculous because they get these enormous monopolies on all the metals in the asteroids or whatever, some crazy thing, and they become just gigantically wealthy, and that's where we're going. But at but the rest of us are like, well, wait a minute, I'm part of this too, and so that's where we really got interested in the fate of the regular investor. And we're really dedicated to that. We're the only company in what is now called Water as a Service that caters to the regular investor, not the private equity fund, not some infrastructure fund, not the VCs, which they all got giant amounts of money. But what about the rest of us? And so that's become kind of our calling card, and we love it. We love relating to regular investors, is where it's at.
So for you, why podcasts? Why were you interested in having podcasts be a medium where you could do this education, you could have these conversations, and you could tell these stories?
Two reasons. Number one, of course, it gets you out there, 1,000 points of light. I'm a very strong believer in that. Show up in a lot of places. It doesn't matter if it's a small podcast, big podcast, just show up. And as part of that, repurposing it onto our own, I do a weekly CEO briefing. I'm up to 247 so far in the Zoom era. Before that, I was doing them as phone calls, but I've kind of done this a weekly thing forever, and I need content for that. So that's very important. The second part of it is I learn a lot. The questions podcasters ask are very useful. They're kind of like a survey says, because these podcasters are talking to a lot of people. And so they themselves are like, oh, yeah, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And it makes me think, oh, yeah, that's a good angle. It makes us smarter. It gives us a more of a multi-point kind of point of view. And that's, in my opinion, the real strength of communication, is when you're communicating from multiple points, not just one. I know that kind of sounds odd, but it's kind of like how the world is going multipolar, right? It's a similar thing. Things are becoming more fragmented, and as a result, you have to appeal to various different audiences in different ways and find the angle that works and so forth. And I have to say also, they also want me to tell me about my failures, which I've had to do.
Yeah.
And it's not a common thing in PR to talk about your failures, but it forces you to talk about it, and it makes you, I think, more human, more real to people. And you kind of, you get a dose of humility. It's like, yeah, I wasn't always perfect, still not perfect. I always, Jeremy, I always think, wow, I was dumb 5 years ago. Well, I'll think, well, what about in 5 years? I'll think how dumb I was today.
I'm always looking at it like, man, I made that choice last week. I'm glad I made the one I made this week. So I totally understand where you're coming from. But you know what? There's two things you hit on there, which I think is really interesting. As I mentioned, like we've been doing these icons interviews for a little bit. So I've had a few conversations before this one. You are the first one to bring up the idea of using it as a survey. That's really smart. I would have never thought of that. That's a really good point. And that's actually something, as a guest, I'm gonna have to try and bring into my own kind of toolkit now when I approach podcasts. It wasn't something I was considering. And I guess the other part about it too is going through those failures. I think now, kind of in this age of like everything's perfect social media and things like that, like those failures also humanize you. And I think for brands having to connect right now, I think being human when everything's becoming less human, I think is actually more important than ever. Is that something you've considered?
Yeah, and it also, I think, if Taylor Swift had some faults that she talked about, she'd be more armored against all the damn criticism. I think she's wonderful. She's getting unjustified criticism, but it's in part because she comes across as perfect.
Yes.
Right? She's just wonderful. She's got an incredible boyfriend, and she's on the covers of all the checkout stand magazines. I'm like, oh, really? She makes muffins too? And it's just ridiculous, right? So it'd be nice if Taylor's PR people were to come up with, the biggest failure is when I was living in a car, right? It was really, really, really good. Mm-hmm. So that basically makes it hard to attack you when you're already saying, yeah, you know what? I can tell you some stories about how I screwed up. Lord, ran a ship on the rocks and somehow got it off. Let me tell you about that. After that, it's like, yeah, okay, so he's got this and that flaw, but he's willing to talk about it, right? And the truth is here's another big deal. A big piece of my operating philosophy is what I trademarked in the early 2000s as mistake-based marketing. Because here's what happened in the year 2000. Up to the year 2000, we were paying for surveys. We were doing research and paying Michael Bach at survey.com, $35,000, $40,000 per survey. And they'd go out there and they'd do these impression surveys and so forth and so on. That was great. Year 2000, all the budgets went away. No more money for surveys. And so we literally had to just throw things out in the market. So what I learned was throw things out in the market, but we willing to take them right back and fix them. And that became this iterative process that is actually, in my opinion, even better than, yes, please survey, but also use have this sort of contact, and you get better and you go, oh, wow. So that also applies to business failures, right? Mm-hmm. The things I've learned from having been a ship captain and contemplating, here I am, my stupid first mate, I was literally on the can while he put the ship on the rocks. But guess what? I was the captain. And I was sitting there in the middle of the night on a coral reef off the Papuan coast in Papua New Guinea, the Louisiade archipelago, and going, wow, by morning, we could all be rowing ashore in lifeboats, right? And like, oh my gosh. Well, we handled it. We took care of it. We got off. It was fine. It was all good. But the point is that, well, what the hell was I doing up on a coral reef in the first place, right? Like, gee, I mean, that's pretty wild. And I basically learned a lot of things about myself. So I believe that failure, properly processed rapidly enough, gets you to success.
Mm-hmm. So I guess when you're looking at like actually being on a show and having the conversation, I guess, what is your approach to the conversation? Like, I guess, how do you balance like what you're trying to get across with what the show's trying to get across? And like, what is your thought process around that?
Sure. Well, first of all, they all have a particular theme. I'm about to go on to a podcast in a little bit, which is what was my worst investment, right?
Mm.
So they have a particular angle, and so that's something you have to groove into. And you just, I think a lot of guests end up really boring.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to be willing to just spice it up and come up with anecdotes and keep it lively, because at the end of the day, you're trying to keep that podcaster's popularity up, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to help them be successful. And so it's really a responsibility of mine to create a really good product for the podcaster that they will take away. And of course, it'll help me because I'll have more distribution out of it. So it's everybody wins. So you really
Mm-hmm.
got to think about, how is this thing going to relate to the audience? How is it exciting? How can I make it unusual, a breakout thing? Because then I can also take snippets from the podcast, and we turn it into clips, and it turns into stuff that we use a lot. That is sort of like, that's wild, right? So all in all, we're in a content game, and when we say content, we're really talking about stuff that turns heads, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's got to turn heads. It's got to stop people. Like, what? That is vital. Because there's too much crap.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow Facebook has figured out that I like, steep skiing videos and dash cam crashes, and that's all it feeds me. Well, they've learned, right? Because that's how I behave. That's what I click on. So that is obviously, those reel makers have done a great job of attracting my interest, and that's where it's at.
Well, I think my Instagram feed thinks I'm my wife, because I'm often like seeing cool recipes and sending them to her, because we're always trying to like make like interesting like homemade things. So I always get the link and send it to her, like, oh, look at this one, we should try this one. So my Instagram feed is literally just like homemade farm recipes. I think they've figured me out. But I guess looking at like podcasting, I think the thing a lot of people don't consider is really you have at least two publics, possibly more when you look at a podcast. You have the host that you're spending time with, and you also have the audience. And I guess for you, how have you dealt with like having two publics? Like how has that worked out for you in terms of like, have there been, ways you've tried to network or other opportunities you've tried to create, or what has that been like, collaborating with two publics, and how have you worked with that?
Well, think of the podcast host. Obviously, he has created that audience, that public that thinks a lot like him, because that's why they're with him, right? So it's not that big a problem, because the host, in a way, is the icon for the audience, right? So if I interest him, I was on a podcast yesterday that was all about helping entrepreneurs succeed, right? Well, so he kept like trying to get lessons out of it. Oh, you see, Riggs is talking about vertical integration, and it's very important, right? And so he'd pull things out and distill them. And so that was his idea. That's why people were drawn to him, right? Was because they could get for free, they could get these nuggets. Well, it's my responsibility to deliver the nuggets, right? That's kind of my job, right? Now, should I be running a podcast? It's I've gone round and round on many times, and the long and the short of it is that the once a week briefing keeps me busy, and the Substack that I really want to get around to doing more content in is the other one. And other people are going to have to be the podcast hosts. That's just how it is.
So I guess in terms of like what you do with the content, I know you referenced a few things here. You mentioned, using their CEO briefings. You've mentioned clips and things. Like, I guess, how do you, reuse content like in your own marketing strategy? Because I think a lot of times people look at a podcast and they have this idea, like you do the podcast and that's it. But I think like the people that really get it understand that like you have the podcast, which is one part of it, and there's also like what you do with it. And I guess for you, what is that strategy of what you use podcast content for been like?
First of all, podcasts are very hard to digest by the general public, right? They have their audience for the podcast itself. Like, I'll give you an example. Peter Rochin does a 2 or 3 hour podcast, but on my Telegram feeds, I get to see the stuff that people have excerpted from it, the clips, right? Like your friend Hervoyer over at Geopolitics and Empire, he will take certain things that are in his line of business, which is very geopolitical.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't have to really watch the whole Peter Rogen thing anymore. I'm kind of getting the little short and sweet of it. And it's good because it's a 3-hour show, right? And it's only so often do I have 3 hours in a car. So the point I'm making is it makes it much more consumable. And so what we do is we'll dice these things up. First of all, the host often does that these days. They come up with clips and we use those. Secondly, we create our own clips, and we've learned. I used to just put a whole 20-minute excerpt of a podcast on my CEO briefing, and people would fall asleep. Instead, I do like 3 clips from the podcast, boom, and comment on them. So I can say, okay, in this podcast, I'm talking about blah, 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 and it's relevant because. So I'm taking the clip, I'm commenting on it, and that makes it usable. And then on top of it, of course, it goes in my X feed. It goes on LinkedIn, various social media reuses. And eventually also it ends up on websites of ours. There's a ton of reuse possible. It's better than me just talking, turning on, the capture app and just talking to the camera. It's better when I'm being talked to, frankly. It just makes it more real, more interesting. And so it makes for very good reuse and syndication.
Is there anything that in terms of podcasting that like I haven't asked you that you're like, this is something I love about podcasting, or this is something that's great about podcasting? It's like, this is the way I always ask the last question, because I find that there's always something that like, they're like, yes, this thing. And I'm like, wow, I wouldn't think to ask you that. But I guess, is there anything like that for you?
Yeah, one of the things that I like about podcast guesting is that they typically ask you for the book you like the most or stuff like that, and I get to share for example business books that I really really have lived by. One of them is The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen, which every single marketer and CEO must read. It saved Intel. Andy Grove actually listened to Clayton Christensen and saved the company.
Wow.
And the other one is Jeffrey Moore's Inside the Tornado, which is another brilliant process book. Those 2 books are in my pantheon. And I get a chance to evangelize these points of view, which is you disrupt. Look, here's the deal. And this is applicable beyond. It used to be just high tech. Now it's every company has been made into a tech company. That's how it is. So the high tech life cycle goes, slow start, then it has to get overcome the barriers of adoption. Then it goes into crazy adoption, and then it tails off, but then it becomes obsolete. And then there's a whole new one. So it's an upward cascade, kind of a wiggle upwards kind of model, right? Which Jeffrey Moore talks about. And then Clayton Christensen talks about the downsides of not reinventing yourself because you will disappear. Those 2 things are of critical importance. And I'm grateful that I get asked that, because it's more important than even the fact that I love The Little Prince is these 2 books are super, super vital.
Very cool. Riggs, I've really appreciated this. I'm sure that people listening have found this really helpful. Where can they find out more about you, and where can they find out more about what you're doing, man?
Okay. Obviously, jump onto my my X, which is Riggs Eck. I'm also Riggs Eckelberry on LinkedIn. You should go to OriginClear, sign up for my weekly briefing every Thursday night. And if you can't make the 8:00 Eastern time performance, which no matter how much I try to change it, nobody wants to change it. Who knows why? You can watch the replay the next day. And finally, go to Substack and sign up for the Break to Build stack, which is all about my philosophy of breaking things to rebuild them with a team. And there's going to be a lot more good stuff coming. So be sure to subscribe.
Awesome. Well, Riggs Eckelberry, thanks for being an icon, and thanks for being here. And we'll definitely have to do something again soon.
Jeremy, thanks for everything you do. It's really appreciated.